The morning everything changed started the same way every morning had started for the past 11 years. With Claire Merritt waking up before the alarm, pulling on her worn terrycloth robe, and padding downstairs to make coffee for a man who would not say thank you. She didn't mind the silence anymore. She had learned to live inside it the way you learn to live inside a house with low ceilings, carefully, with your head perpetually bowed. Their kitchen was small, but she had made it beautiful. Copper pots hung from a rack she'd installed herself. A window herb garden lined the sill, basil, thyme, rosemary, things she tended the way she tended everything in her life. Quietly, consistently, without applause. The morning light hit the copper pots and scattered gold across the walls, and for a few minutes, before Derek came downstairs, the kitchen belonged entirely to her. She heard him on the stairs. Heavy-footed. Always heavy-footed, as if the floor needed to know he was coming. Derek Merritt was not a bad-looking man, and he knew it in that dangerous way that men know things about themselves, as a fact to be leveraged, not a gift to be grateful for. He was 43, broad-shouldered, with thick dark hair silvering at the temples that women at his office apparently found distinguished. Claire had overheard that word once, at a company Christmas party. Distinguished. She had smiled into her champagne and said nothing. "Morning," he said, not looking at her. "Coffee's ready." She slid the mug across the counter. He sat down at the kitchen table with his phone, scrolling through something with his jaw set tight. That jaw. She used to find it handsome. Now it just looked like effort, like he was constantly bracing himself against a world that owed him more than it was delivering. "You work late tonight?" she asked. "Probably." She nodded and turned back to the stove to make his eggs. Scrambled, soft, a little pepper, no salt. 11 years and she had his breakfast memorized down to the molecule. That was what a decade of marriage looked like, she supposed. Not passion. Not grand declarations. Just the accumulated muscle memory of caring for someone. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have known standing there in her terrycloth robe with a spatula in her hand, was that Derek had been carrying something in the breast pocket of his jacket for the past 3 days. A small rectangle of paper. A lottery ticket he'd bought on a Tuesday impulse at the gas station down the street. The same gas station where he'd been buying tickets every week for 6 years with the same 6 numbers. The date of his mother's birthday, his college jersey number, and 4 digits he claimed meant nothing, but that Claire had once looked up and recognized as the anniversary of a relationship he'd had before her. She had never mentioned that. She had filed it away in the same cabinet where she kept all the things she noticed, and chose not to say. She plated his eggs and set them in front of him. He looked up from his phone. For just a moment, just a fraction of a second, something moved across his face. Something she couldn't read. A flicker. Like a man who is keeping a secret, and is not entirely sure yet what to do with it. "Thanks," he said. She nearly dropped the spatula. He hadn't said that in months. She turned back to the sink and began washing the pan, and she told herself it meant nothing, that one word, that small ordinary mercy of a word. She told herself she was not the kind of woman who built hope out of a single thanks. But she was. She always had been. And she couldn't feel yet what that small ember of hope was about to cost her. Later that morning, after Derek left for work and Claire had finished her own breakfast standing over the sink the way she always did, another habit she'd never examined, she sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop to work on the freelance accounting files she'd been quietly building for 3 years. This was the thing about Claire that most people didn't see. She was not simply a housewife who cooked beautiful breakfasts and grew herbs on a windowsill. She was, underneath the terrycloth robe and the practiced invisibility, extraordinarily competent. She held a degree in financial management that she'd earned before she met Derek, before he'd suggested, gently at first, then less gently, that his career was the one that needed cultivating, that it simply made more sense for her to handle the house, that surely she didn't mind. She had built her freelance practice quietly, the way she built everything. 3 clients in year 1, 7 in year 2, 14 now. Not one of them had ever met her in person. She worked from the kitchen table while Derek was at the office, and she had her own bank account that Derek didn't know about, and she told herself that this was just prudence. Just common sense. Just a woman being careful. She was halfway through a quarterly report when her phone rang. It was her sister, Donna. "Turn on the news," Donna said without preamble. "Why? What happened?" "Just turn it on, Claire. Channel 7. Right now." Something in her sister's voice, not panic exactly, but a kind of breathless certainty, made Claire's stomach drop before she even reached for the remote. She turned on the television. A local news segment was running a story she almost scrolled past. Local man claims state lottery jackpot. Largest single winner in county history. And there was Derek, her husband, standing in front of a lottery commission backdrop, holding an oversized check, grinning with every single tooth in his head. The number on the check had so many zeros that Claire had to count them twice. $14,600,000. The room tilted. She sat very still in the kitchen where she had made his eggs that morning, soft scrambled, a little pepper, no salt. And she looked at her husband's face on the television screen and she thought, with extraordinary calm, he knew. He already knew when I handed him that coffee. And then she thought something else. Something quieter. Something that would turn out to be the most important thought she'd had in 11 years. Why didn't he tell me? She would not have to wait long for the answer. But nothing about that answer would be what she expected. Derek came home at 4 in the afternoon, 3 hours earlier than usual, and Claire knew by the way he walked through the door, shoulders back, chin lifted, like a man practicing a posture he intended to get used to, that the conversation she'd been rehearsing in her head all day was about to be replaced by one she hadn't prepared for. She had changed out of her robe. She'd put on the blue dress that she knew fit her well, and she'd done her hair, and she had set the kitchen table with the good dishes, because she wasn't sure why, but it seemed important to meet this moment with some kind of dignity. "You saw," he said. "I saw." He set his keys on the counter and looked around the kitchen, at the copper pots, the herb garden, the table set for two with the good dishes, and something in his expression shifted in a way she couldn't quite name. It was not warmth exactly. It was something more complicated than warmth. 14 million, she said, because she needed to say the number out loud to believe it. 14.6, he corrected, and the correction landed like a small stone in still water. Already possessive of the precision. Before taxes, obviously. After federal and state, we're looking at somewhere around 9.2. We. He had said we. She held on to that word carefully. Derek. She sat down. Why didn't you tell me? You've been carrying that ticket for 3 days. He was quiet for a moment. He poured himself a glass of water from the tap, not the filtered pitcher she kept in the fridge, the tap, as if he was already somewhere else in his mind, and the details of this kitchen no longer quite applied to him. I needed to think, he said. Think about what? He turned and looked at her then. Really looked at her. And she recognized the look. She had seen it before in small ways. When she'd suggested they take a vacation, and he'd said maybe next year for 4 years running. When she'd mentioned her freelance clients and he'd smiled in a way that never quite reached his eyes. It was the look of a man who had made a decision, and was now simply managing the announcement. I've been unhappy for a long time, Claire. The good dishes suddenly felt very fragile. I know we've had problems, she started. I'm not talking about problems. His voice was calm. Terrifyingly calm. I'm talking about my life. The life I actually want. I've been sleepwalking, and now I have the chance to wake up, and I need to take it. She heard the words. She processed them individually, clinically, the way she processed numbers. And then she understood what he was not yet quite saying. You want a divorce, she said. I think it's best. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside a car passed. The basil on the windowsill moved slightly in the draft from the window she'd left cracked open that morning. You won the lottery, she said slowly. And your first thought was to leave me. It clarified things. She stopped. Took a breath. Derek, I have put 11 years into this marriage. Into this house. Into your career, your comfort, And I appreciate that. Don't. Her voice came out sharper than she'd intended, and she watched him blink. She never raised her voice. She almost never raised her voice. Don't appreciate me like I'm a service you're canceling. I am your wife. You were. 2 words. She would remember the precise weight of them for the rest of her life. She stood up. She needed to stand up. What happens to the house? That's what I needed to talk to you about. He put the water glass down and crossed his arms over his chest, and she noticed everything she always had, that he was wearing his good watch. The one he only wore for important meetings. He had dressed for this. He had prepared. The house is in my name. The floor shifted beneath her. She had known that. She had known the house was in his name because when they'd bought it 11 years ago he'd said it was better for the mortgage rates, better for his credit profile, that she was his wife, and what was his was hers, what was hers was his. What was his was his. What was hers had just become a question. I want you out by the end of the week, Derek said. I'll give you 2 months of expenses. That's fair. She looked at him for a very long time. At this man she had made eggs for every morning. At this man whose laundry she had folded, whose sick days she had managed, whose mother she had driven to chemotherapy for 4 months while he was swamped at work. 2 months, she repeated. It's generous, Claire. She picked up her water glass from the table and walked to the sink and set it down, and she stood with her back to him for a moment, because she needed her face to herself for just a few seconds before she turned back around. When she did turn around, her expression was something he clearly hadn't expected. It was not tears. It was not rage. It was something much quieter and much more dangerous. No, she said. Derek blinked. Excuse me? I don't need your dirty money. The words arrived in her mouth as if they had always been waiting there. Get out. His face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, amusement, and then something that looked remarkably like the beginning of real surprise. Claire, I own this house. You don't get to tell me to. Then I'll get a lawyer first thing tomorrow morning. She held his gaze without flinching. And we'll talk about what 11 years of unpaid domestic labor plus my abandoned career looks like in a divorce settlement in this state. We'll talk about marital assets. We'll talk about equitable distribution. She watched the color shift in his face. I have a degree in financial management, Derek. Did you forget that? Did you forget that while you were busy thinking I was just the woman who made your eggs? He had forgotten. She could see it in his eyes. He had forgotten completely. And for the first time in the conversation, it was Derek who looked uncertain. But Claire didn't know yet what he'd already set in motion the moment he'd called his brother from the lottery office parking lot 4 days ago. She didn't know what Derek's brother, a man named Ray who practiced family law, had already begun preparing. She didn't know what was coming for her in the morning. She was still believing in that moment that the worst of it had already arrived. She did not sleep. She lay in what was still technically her bed, in what was still technically her house, and she listened to Derek moving around in the guest room down the hall. The guest room she had furnished and painted and filled with the good towels, and she stared at the ceiling and ran numbers. That was how Claire had always coped. Not with wine, not with phone calls to friends at midnight, not with crying jags on the bathroom floor, though she allowed herself a brief, precise cry at around 2 a.m. that she completed in exactly 7 minutes. She coped with numbers, with the architecture of her own situation laid out in columns. Assets, liabilities, leverage, exposure. What she knew. The house was in Derek's name. Their joint checking account held, at last look, approximately $14,000. She had her own account, her quiet account, her just-in-case account, with $31,000 in it, built over 3 years of freelance work. She had her clients. She had her skills. She had the financial records of 11 years of marriage, which was more than most people walked away from divorce with. What she didn't know, what Derek and his lawyer brother had already put in place. She found out at 8 a.m. when a man in a gray suit knocked on the front door. She answered it in her blue dress from the day before because she hadn't been to bed properly and wasn't going to answer the door in a robe. The man handed her a manila envelope without quite meeting her eyes and said, "Mrs. Merritt, you've been served," and was back in his car before she fully understood what was happening. She stood in the open doorway with the morning air cold on her face and the envelope in her hands, and she heard Derek at the top of the stairs behind her. "I told you I'd taken care of things," he said. She opened the envelope at the kitchen table with the same methodical precision with which she opened quarterly financial reports. She read everything. She read it twice. Derek's brother Ray. She had sat next to Ray at Thanksgiving for 11 consecutive years and complimented his terrible wine choices and driven his kids to the airport once. Had filed for an expedited divorce proceeding on the grounds of irreconcilable differences, accompanied by a separation agreement that offered Claire a lump sum of $45,000 and the contents of their joint checking account in exchange for a full waiver of any claim to marital property or Derek's lottery. Winnings, which the agreement carefully characterized as a separate, post-separation financial event. Post-separation. He had backdated the separation. She read that clause 4 times to make sure she was reading it correctly. And she was. They were claiming the marriage had effectively ended, on paper, according to the documentation Ray had constructed 6 weeks ago, before the lottery win, which would mean, if it held, that the $14 million was Derek's alone. She set the papers down very carefully on the kitchen table. Derek was leaning against the doorframe, watching her read. When she looked up, he spread his hands in what he probably imagined was a gesture of reasonableness. 45 plus the joint account is nearly $60,000, Claire. That's more than fair for a marriage with no children and no shared. You backdated the separation, she said. We'd been having problems for some time. Ray simply. You fabricated documents. Her voice was so quiet and so steady that Derek actually stopped talking. That's fraud, Derek. It's a legal interpretation. I want you to listen to me very carefully. She folded her hands on the table. 11 years of marriage, and she had never spoken to him in this register. This particular frequency of absolute certainty. She watched him hear it and not quite know what to do with it. I am going to get dressed. I am going to drive downtown. And I am going to walk into the office of the best matrimonial attorney in this city. And then I am going to make sure that every single thing you have tried to do here gets examined in exquisite detail. Derek's expression flickered. Something behind his eyes recalculated. The offer has an expiration, he said. Ray said. I don't care what Ray said. She stood up. I want you to think about something while I'm gone. Think about what it costs to fight a fraud allegation in court. Think about what a forensic financial audit of a lottery claim looks like. Think about what 11 years of marriage looks like when the wife has kept records. She walked past him and up the stairs, and she didn't look back. She was in the shower when she heard it, muffled through the bathroom wall, Derek on his phone, his voice low and urgent. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the tone. And the tone was the sound of a man who had just realized he might have made a miscalculation. She stood under the hot water and let herself breathe. She had 40 minutes before the first attorney's office opened. She had a plan. She had $31,000 in an account he didn't know existed. What she didn't have yet was the information that was waiting for her on her phone. The text message from a number she didn't recognize that had arrived at 6:47 a.m. while she was still lying awake doing math on the ceiling. She would see it when she got out of the shower. And it was going to change everything she thought she knew about what was actually happening in her marriage. The number was not in her contacts. The text was 4 sentences long. She read it standing in the bathroom with a towel around her wet hair and water still dripping from the ends. Mrs. Merritt, you don't know me, but I know what's happening to you. Derek has been planning this for longer than you think. Check the account ending in 4471. I'm sorry. That was all. She sat down on the edge of the bathtub. Account ending in 4471. She ran through every financial account she was aware of in their marriage. Their joint checking ended in 2208. Their savings ended in 0093. The mortgage account she'd helped set up 11 years ago ended in 7714. She did not know any account ending in 4471. She thought about calling the number. She thought about texting back. Instead, she did something more useful. She got dressed, drove downtown, and sat across the desk from an attorney named Patricia Voss, who had 17 years of matrimonial law experience, a reputation sharp enough to make Derek's brother Ray reportedly nervous at bar association events, and the kind of steady, measured attention that made Claire feel, for the first time in 24 hours, that she was talking to someone who was genuinely listening. She told Patricia everything. The lottery. The envelope. The backdated separation. The text message. Patricia listened without interrupting. She made notes. When Claire finished, Patricia set down her pen and laced her fingers together on her desk and said, "The backdating is the thread we pull first. If the paperwork doesn't hold up, the entire separation agreement collapses. And if there are undisclosed accounts, which the text suggests, that's a discovery goldmine. Can they hide lottery winnings in a divorce proceeding? People try," Patricia said. "They rarely succeed when they're up against someone who knows how to look." She paused. "I need you to do something before we file anything. I need you to gather every financial document you can access from your marriage. Tax returns, bank statements, any joint account paperwork. Whatever you can put your hands on legally and quickly." Claire nodded. She had already been thinking about the filing cabinet in Derek's home office. The one with the small key that he thought she didn't know about. She knew where the key was because she'd found it 3 years ago tucked in a winter coat she'd pulled out to have dry cleaned. And she'd assumed at the time that it was a spare for something ordinary, and she had put it back and not mentioned it because that was what she did. She noticed things and filed them away. "I want to find that account," Claire said. "The one ending in 4471. Patricia wrote something on her legal pad. "What do you know about your husband's financial behavior over the past year or two? Anything unusual? Anything that seemed off?" Claire thought about it. And as she thought, something shifted in her memory. A sequence of small things she had registered and dismissed. An extra credit card statement she'd once caught a glimpse of and assumed was for work expenses. A weekend trip to a financial seminar that he'd described as mandatory. A password changed on a computer that used to be open. More than I realized, she said quietly. Patricia nodded slowly. That's usually the case. She picked up her pen again. I have to ask you something directly. Is there any possibility Derek has been planning this exit for longer than the lottery win would suggest? Any evidence of premeditation? The word landed between them with a particular weight. Claire thought of the text message. Derek has been planning this for longer than you think. She thought of the 6 numbers on his lottery ticket. His mother's birthday, his jersey number, and the anniversary of another woman. She thought of 11 years of a man who had never quite let her all the way in. Yes, she said. I think there might be. She walked out of Patricia's office 40 minutes later with a retainer agreement signed and a list of things to gather. She sat in her car in the downtown parking garage, and she took out her phone and she looked at the text from the unknown number again. And this time she noticed something she had missed the first time. Something small at the very bottom of the text, visible only if you scrolled. A second message, sent 11 minutes after the first, that simply read, "He's not alone in this." Her hands were very still on the phone. He's not alone, which meant there was someone else. And that someone, whoever had sent these texts, was afraid enough of something to warn her anonymously, but not afraid enough of something else to say more. She needed to know who had sent these messages. She needed to find that account. And she needed to do both before Derek realized what she was doing. What she didn't know yet was that the unknown number belonged to someone inside Derek's own life. Someone far closer than she could have guessed. And when she found out who it was, she was going to have to completely rebuild her understanding of the past 3 years of her marriage. If you're still watching right now, you're exactly the kind of viewer I love. Subscribe so I can keep giving you stories that touch your heart. Hit that bell so you never miss what happens next. She went home while Derek was out. His car was gone and the house had the particular quiet of a space recently vacated. A coffee mug on the counter, still warm. The smell of his cologne fading near the stairs. She had maybe 2 hours. She went directly to his office. The key was exactly where she had replaced it 3 years ago, in the small ceramic dish on the bookshelf where he kept paper clips and a few foreign coins from a business trip. She picked it up without ceremony, crossed to the filing cabinet, and opened it. She was not someone who rattled easily. But what she found in the bottom drawer of that filing cabinet made her sit down on the floor of Derek's office with the papers spread around her and stay there for a very long time. There were 2 sets of documents. The first was a set of financial records for an LLC she had never heard of, Merritt Horizon Holdings, incorporated 14 months ago. Not in their state. In Delaware, where LLC structures offered maximum opacity. She was familiar with this strategy. She had helped 3 of her freelance clients navigate Delaware LLCs in their financial planning. She knew exactly what it looked like when someone used one to move money privately. The second set of documents was harder to understand at first. It appeared to be a property record. A deed. For a house, not their house, a different property in a town about 40 miles north. Purchased 8 months ago. In Derek's name alone. He had bought a house. 8 months ago. While they were married. He had bought a second house and never told her. She photographed everything with her phone. Every page, both sides, in good light. Her hands were steady, because she made them steady. At the back of the drawer, tucked under a folder labeled insurance, auto, she found a personal bank statement. The account number at the top ended in 4471. The balance in the account was not large by lottery standards. A little over $80,000. But the transaction history went back 22 months. Regular deposits. Not enormous individually. Consistent. The kind of financial behavior that looks, to someone who knows what they're looking at, like money being moved out of a household in small enough increments to avoid notice. He had been siphoning. For almost 2 years, Derek had been slowly, quietly, deliberately moving money out of their shared financial life into a private account. Building a runway. Building an exit. Claire sat on the floor of his office and looked at the deposit dates, and she cross-referenced them in her mind against the timeline of their marriage, and she found the pattern with the ease of someone who had spent 3 years reading other people's financial stories for a living. The deposit started 2 months after a particular weekend in the winter, 22 months ago. She knew that weekend. They had spent it at her sister Donna's cabin, and it had been one of the better weekends they'd had in years. Good food, long walks, Derek almost relaxed, almost present. She had come home from that weekend thinking, maybe something was shifting between them. Something had been shifting. Just not in the direction she'd thought. She put the bank statement back exactly as she'd found it. She locked the cabinet. She returned the key to the ceramic dish with the paper clips. And she walked out of his office and down the stairs and into the kitchen, and she stood at the sink, and she looked out the window at the herb garden. The basil needed water. She watered it. She watered all of them. The thyme, the rosemary, the small pot of mint she'd started from a cutting last spring. She stood at the sink doing this ordinary, careful thing, and she felt the shape of what she now knew settle around her like something permanent. She had her photographs. She had her attorney. She had her quiet account. She had 3 years of freelance records that established her financial independence. She had the text messages. She had the filing cabinet's contents. What she needed now was the person who had sent those texts. Because that person knew something she didn't. Something specific enough that they'd used the phrase "he's not alone in this." Which meant there was someone else with skin in this. Someone who had reason to either help Derek or reason to fear him. She sent a single text back to the unknown number. "I found it. Who are you?" She waited. 20 minutes. 30. No response. Then, at minute 37, a reply. "Not yet. Meet me Thursday. The coffee shop on Alderman Street. 10 a.m. Come alone." She stared at the message for a long moment. Thursday was 2 days away. Patricia needed these documents now. The divorce filing needed to happen before Derek could liquidate the LLC or move the lottery winnings into a structure that would make them harder to reach. 2 days felt like a very long time. She almost called Patricia and told her to proceed without waiting for Thursday. She nearly made that call. Her finger was actually on the dial button. But something stopped her. Instinct, maybe. The same instinct that had kept $31,000 in a secret account. The sense that the unknown number knew something that would make everything else more powerful if she waited 2 more days. She put the phone down. She was going to wait. She was going to go to that coffee shop. And she was going to find out who, besides Derek, had decided that her life was something to be quietly dismantled. She never considered, not once in those 2 days, that the person she was about to meet would not just change her strategy, but would force her to question whether she had ever truly understood the marriage she was fighting for. The coffee shop on Alderman Street was narrow and warm and smelled of espresso and old wood. She arrived at 9:52 and chose a table in the corner with a clear sight line to both the door and the window. She ordered a black coffee and sat with her hands around the mug, and she watched the door. At 10:04, a woman walked in. She was perhaps 35, with dark auburn hair cut short and precise, wearing a good coat, the kind that communicates money without announcing it. She paused inside the doorway and scanned the room, and her eyes found Claire's with the immediacy of someone who already knew what she looked like. She crossed the room and sat down across from her without saying hello and set her bag on the empty chair beside her. And they looked at each other for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people who are about to say things that cannot be unsaid. "My name is Nadia," the woman said. Claire waited. "I've been seeing Derek for 2 years. The coffee mug was warm under Claire's hands. She kept her hands very still around it. "All right," she said, because that was the only thing she trusted herself to say. Nadia's eyes moved briefly to the table and then back up. She had clearly rehearsed this, Claire could tell, and was finding that the rehearsal was not quite covering the reality. "I didn't know he was married. Not at first. He told me he was separated. He showed me. He had paperwork, documents, something that was supposed to be a legal separation agreement, and I believed him." "The documents were fake," Claire said. Nadia blinked. "Yes. I figured that out eventually. About 6 months ago. And by that point," she stopped. Started again. "He had already put money in my name. Into an account. My name is on the LLC, Mrs. Merritt. He put me on the Merritt Horizon Holdings LLC as a 50% owner. He told me it was an investment vehicle, something for our future. Something he'd set up before the lottery." Claire felt the architecture of it assemble itself in her mind with terrible clarity. "He was planning to gift you marital assets through the LLC," she said. "And because your name was on it legitimately from before the lottery win, it would look like a legitimate business structure." "Yes." Nadia's voice was very quiet. "I only understood the full picture 3 weeks ago when I started asking questions. When I hired my own attorney to understand what I'd signed. And you sent me the text. I sent you the text. Because my attorney told me that if any of what Derek did constitutes fraud, the fake separation documents, the hidden account, the LLC structure, then I could be implicated. I signed documents. I accepted money." Her jaw tightened. "I was used, Mrs. Merritt. And when I realized I was used, I decided I wasn't going to participate in what he's doing to you." Claire looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the weekend at Donna's cabin. She thought about the small, consistent deposits starting 2 months later. She thought about the anniversary date embedded in Derek's lottery numbers, the anniversary of a relationship before her. And she wondered, with a clarity that felt more sad than angry, whether Nadia had known Derek's lottery ticket numbers. Whether she had perhaps been the one who picked them. "The property up north," Claire said. "The house he bought 8 months ago." Nadia's expression answered before she spoke. "He showed it to me as our future home. He was going to leave you, take his lottery winnings through the LLC structure, and we were going to start over. With money that is half mine by law." "Yes." The coffee shop hummed quietly around them. Someone ordered a latte at the counter. A child at another table dropped a spoon. "What do you want from me?" Claire asked. "I want you to know the full picture before you fight this. And I want—" Nadia opened her bag and placed a manila folder on the table between them. "I want to give you these. My attorney made copies. Every document Derek had me sign. Every transaction into the LLC that I have records of. Every text message he sent me that references the plan to move the lottery winnings before the divorce was finalized." Claire looked at the folder. She did not pick it up immediately. She thought about what Patricia had said. "That's a discovery gold mine." This was not a gold mine. This was an entire mine. "Why?" Claire asked. "Why help me? What does this get you?" Nadia looked at her steadily. "I need to be a witness. I need to cooperate with whatever legal proceeding comes next. My attorney says that is the cleanest path out of my own legal exposure. But I also," she paused, "I also think what he did to you is wrong. And I think what he did to me is wrong. And I find that I am very tired of letting men like Derek Merritt manage the stories of our lives." Claire picked up the folder. She opened it. She looked at the first page for a long moment. The first document was a text thread between Derek and Nadia, and the third message down, time-stamped 11 months ago, read, "Once the lottery comes in, we're done waiting. I've been laying groundwork for 2 years. Claire won't see it coming." The room was very quiet. She closed the folder. She looked at Nadia across the table. And she said, "I'd like you to meet my attorney. Can you come tomorrow morning?" Nadia nodded. Claire picked up the folder and put it in her bag and picked up her coffee and she drank it, and it was very good coffee, and she sat there in the narrow warm room and let herself feel, for just a moment, controlled and precise, the full shape of the fury that had been building in her since she'd seen Derek's face on the television screen. And then she put it away. She would need it later. But right now she had work to do. She had absolutely no idea, as she walked out of that coffee shop, that Derek was at that exact moment sitting in Patricia Voss's waiting room. Not as an opposing party. Not by coincidence. He had found out about her attorney. And he had come to attempt something so audacious that when Patricia's assistant called Claire 20 minutes later, the assistant's voice actually shook. Patricia's assistant was a composed young woman named Beth who had worked for matrimonial attorneys long enough that very little surprised her. The fact that her voice had a slight tremor when she called Claire was therefore significant. "Mrs. Merritt," Beth said, "your husband is currently in our waiting room. He arrived about 15 minutes ago and requested an emergency consultation. He says he has information that materially changes your case." Claire stood on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop, the folder from Nadia in her bag, and processed this. "He knows I retained Patricia. Apparently. He said he wants to negotiate directly. Without attorneys." Beth paused. "Ms. Voss has not seen him and will not without your consent. But she asked me to call you immediately." "Tell him to wait," Claire said. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. She was there in 8. Patricia met her in the hallway outside her office, away from the waiting room, and briefed her quietly. Derek had told Beth that he had evidence Claire had been hiding financial assets during the marriage, specifically a private bank account, and that he intended to use this to recharacterize the divorce settlement terms. He had found out about her account. Somehow he had found the quiet account. "He can't weaponize it the way he's hoping," Patricia said immediately, reading Claire's expression. "Self-preservation savings during a troubled marriage is not misconduct. But he's going to try to use it as a negotiating chip to pressure you into accepting a smaller settlement before we file." "He's scared," Claire said. "He's desperate, which is worse. What did you find at the coffee shop?" She looked at Claire's bag. Claire handed her the folder. She watched Patricia open it. She watched Patricia read the first page. She watched the careful, professional neutrality of Patricia's expression undergo a small but definitive shift. the shift of an attorney who has just been handed something better than expected. This is Derek's own words, Patricia said slowly, reading the text thread. 11 months ago. His plan. In his own text messages. Patricia looked up. And the source is willing to testify? She'll be here tomorrow morning. There was a beat of silence. Patricia closed the folder and looked at Claire with a directness that felt almost like respect. He's in my waiting room, she said. Do you want to see him? Claire thought about it. She thought about what was in the folder. She thought about the house 40 miles north, bought 8 months ago, furnished with plans that included someone else. She thought about 11 years of breakfasts and laundry, and her mother-in-law's chemotherapy appointments, and a career she had shrunk to fit inside a marriage that had been, apparently, scheduled for demolition. Yes, she said. I want to see him. They walked into the waiting room together, Claire and Patricia, side by side. And Derek looked up from his phone and something passed across his face when he saw Patricia. He'd been expecting Claire alone. He'd been expecting, Claire realized, a woman who could be maneuvered. He stood up. He had dressed carefully. She noticed the good watch again. Claire, he said. I think we can still handle this ourselves. Without making it messy. We're past that, Derek. I know about your account. He kept his voice low, reasonable. The voice he used in meetings. I know you've been hiding money. We can call this even and settle privately, and both walk away clean. The account is documented as freelance income, Patricia said pleasantly. Earned during the marriage but fully disclosed upon request. That's not hiding assets, Mr. Merritt. That's ordinary savings. Derek's eyes moved to Patricia, then back to Claire. Something shifted. What do you want? He said. Equitable distribution, Claire said. The house. Half of all marital assets accumulated during the marriage. And a forensic audit of Merritt Horizon Holdings. She watched the name of the LLC land. She watched Derek's face go very still. How do you? He stopped. I want the northern property included in the asset inventory as well, Claire continued. The one on Mill Creek Road. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. As if the woman who had made his eggs for 11 years had just stood up and spoken in a language he hadn't known she knew. This goes to court, he said. And it gets ugly for everyone. That depends entirely on you. She held his gaze. You have until tomorrow morning to instruct your attorney to engage in good faith settlement discussions. If you don't, we file and everything in that folder becomes part of the public court record. She did not tell him what was in the folder. She let him wonder. She watched him wonder. She turned and walked back toward Patricia's office, and she heard Derek say from behind her, in a voice that had lost all its meeting room smoothness. Claire. She stopped. Did not turn around. I didn't think you'd fight, he said. She walked into Patricia's office and closed the door softly behind her. She sat down across from Patricia's desk and clasped her hands in her lap and allowed herself to breathe for 3 full seconds. Then she looked up and said, What do we file first? But what came next? What happened the following morning when Derek's attorney finally called was something neither she nor Patricia had fully anticipated. And it would make everything Claire had fought for so far look like merely the opening act. Patricia filed the petition the next morning. It landed with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a document that has been prepared by someone who knows exactly what they're doing and takes genuine satisfaction in doing it precisely right. Within 48 hours, Derek's attorney, a man from a large downtown firm, not his brother Ray, who had apparently recused himself from the case once the fraud exposure became clear, reached out to request a preliminary conference. The fraud allegation changed everything. A forensic financial audit was ordered by the court as a condition of the preliminary discovery process. This was the thread Patricia had promised to pull, and when it came loose, it did not come loose neatly. It unraveled. The auditor's name was a woman called Renata, and she arrived in Claire's life like a cold front, brisk, thorough, entirely unmoved by anyone's feelings about what she found. She spent 4 days working through the financial architecture of the Merritt's marriage, and at the end of it, she sat down with Claire and Patricia and delivered her findings in the same tone one might use to report on quarterly earnings. Merritt Horizon Holdings had been used to receive, conceal, and redirect a total of $212,000 over the previous 22 months. This included Derek's own pre-lottery diversion of money from household accounts as well as, in the final 2 months, a significant portion of lottery winnings that had been prematurely moved into the LLC structure before the divorce filing was complete. The shell structure had been set up to collapse the winnings into a business entity that would then be used to purchase the northern property outright, making it appear to be a business asset rather than marital property. The backdated separation documents had also collapsed under scrutiny. 2 witnesses, a notary whose signature appeared on the documents and who could not verify signing them on the claimed date, and Ray himself, whose own professional exposure had apparently motivated him to provide a clarifying affidavit, cooperated with the investigation. And Nadia, sitting in Patricia's office on the second morning, was precise and composed, and gave everything she had in the way that someone gives things when they are trying to both make amends and save themselves. Claire watched her from across the table and felt something complicated. Not quite forgiveness, but a recognition that they had both been pieces in a game whose rules neither of them had been shown. The settlement negotiation lasted 11 days. Claire was present for all of it. Patricia had offered to handle the meetings without her, but Claire declined. She sat at the conference table in the downtown law firm in the good dress, the blue one which had become, without her quite deciding so, her armor, and she listened carefully and spoke precisely and did not flinch. Derek was present for the first 2 meetings. Then he sent only his attorney, which told Claire something about the nature of his courage that she had perhaps always partly known. On the 11th day they reached an agreement. The house, their house, the one with the copper pots and the herb garden, and the window she always left cracked, went to Claire. The northern property, purchased with commingled marital funds, was liquidated and split. Her share of the marital assets, including a proportional claim against the lottery winnings on the grounds that the LLC structure had commingled them with marital finances before the filing date, came to $3.4 million after tax considerations. She sat in the conference room when the number was confirmed, and she looked at it on paper for a long time. $3.4 million. The return on 11 years of investment. Not just domestic labor, not just a shrunk-down career, but the specific and irreplaceable value of being the person who had held everything together while someone else planned their exit. Patricia uncapped a pen and slid the signature page across the table. Claire picked up the pen, and then she put it down again. Her attorney looked at her. "There's one more thing," Claire said. "I want it written into the agreement that Derek provides a formal written acknowledgement of the fraudulent backdating of the separation documents. Not as a criminal admission, I understand the distinction, but as part of the settlement record. Signed. Dated. On file." Derek's attorney across the table made a small sound. "That's not a standard," he started. "It doesn't need to be standard," Claire said. "It needs to be in the agreement or we don't have one." There was a long pause. Derek's attorney excused himself and made a phone call in the hallway. He was gone for 4 minutes. When he came back, his expression told her the answer before he spoke. "Agreed," he said. She picked up the pen and signed. She walked out of the building into the afternoon sunlight with the signed agreement in Patricia's hands and the cold air on her face, and she stood on the pavement for a moment and did not feel what she expected to feel. She expected some form of triumph, some bright, declared victory. What she felt instead was quieter than that, more like the sensation of putting down something very heavy that you have been carrying for so long you forgot it had weight. What came next, the life she had to actually build, was something she had not yet let herself fully imagine. But there was something waiting for her when she got home that afternoon. Something that was going to remind her, very suddenly and very sharply, of exactly who she was and exactly what she was capable of. She drove back to the house after the signing. It was hers now, officially, legally, as of the signature page. The deed transfer would take a few weeks to process, but in practical terms, she had already been living there alone for most of the past 3 weeks. Derek having moved to a serviced apartment with the particular efficiency of a man who had packed a bag months before he needed to. She let herself in through the front door and stood in the hallway for a moment. The house was exactly as she had left it that morning. Her coat on the hook by the door. The small console table she'd bought at an estate sale 3 years ago. The one Derek had said was too old-fashioned. The wood floors she'd had refinished herself. One summer when Derek was traveling for work, by watching online tutorials and sanding by hand for a weekend and a half. She walked through the house the way you walk through a place that is becoming yours in a new way. Slowly, touching the walls, opening the curtains further, looking at things that have always been there as if seeing them for the first time. In the kitchen, the basil had grown considerably since she'd watered it during the filing cabinet investigation. The thyme was lush and full. The rosemary was reaching toward the window with a directness she found unexpectedly moving. She put on the kettle and sat at the kitchen table. She had $3.4 million incoming, and a freelance accounting practice with 14 clients, and a law degree's worth of hard-won knowledge about what she was capable of when properly motivated. She had an attorney who had already mentioned that she knew 3 small businesses, looking for a CFO equivalent on retainer. She had a sister who had been calling every day and whose cabin up north, the other north, the good north, the one full of her own life, was always available. She was beginning to understand a great deal. What she also had, sitting in her email inbox when she opened her laptop at the kitchen table, was a message from a name she recognized. A former colleague from her financial management career, a woman she'd worked alongside for 2 years before she'd met Derek, and before her career had been gently, consistently minimized. The message subject line read, "Heard through the grapevine, coffee this week?" The grapevine. In a city this size, the divorce of a man who'd won the state lottery was not exactly a private event. The local news had run a follow-up item. Claire had been mentioned only as the estranged wife, which she found she didn't mind at all. She had always preferred to be underestimated. She wrote back, "Thursday works. You name the place." She closed the laptop and picked up her tea and walked to the window and looked out at the back garden. Her garden, the one she'd designed and planted and maintained. And she thought about what it meant to have built something. Really built it. Not just the visible things, the herb garden, the refinished floors, the copper pots. But the invisible ones, the capacity to remain steady under pressure, the habit of noticing everything, the financial literacy she had kept alive through 3 years of quiet practice against the day she might need it. She had needed it, and it had been there. Her phone buzzed. A text from Donna. "Are you okay?" She looked at the question for a moment. The most honest answer was also, she realized, one she had not been able to give in a very long time. She typed back, yes. Actually, genuinely yes. She stood at the window drinking her tea in the house that was hers while the afternoon light moved across the garden, and she made a list in her mind. Not of losses, not of grievances, but of what she wanted. A list she had not let herself make in 11 years, because there had always seemed to be more pressing things to attend to. What she wanted was this. The house and work that used her real abilities and her sister, and new people who would know her at full size from the beginning, and perhaps eventually someone who would say thank you not as a rare grace, but as the ordinary common decency it actually was. It was not a complicated list, but it was entirely, completely, authentically hers. She was setting her empty mug in the sink when her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. Different from Nadia's number. Different from any number she'd seen in recent weeks. She almost didn't answer it. But she did. She always did. She was someone who answered things. What the person on the other end of the line said next was something she had not seen coming from any direction. It was something that reframed, retroactively, a piece of the past 3 years that she had thought she understood. And it required her to make a decision, in the next 10 minutes, that would shape not just her own future, but the futures of several other people who had, in various ways, been circling this story without ever quite meeting each other. She gripped the phone. She listened. And when the voice on the other end finished speaking, she walked to the window and looked out at the garden and said, "Tell me exactly what you need." 6 months later. The consulting firm had been Donna's idea, in the original version of it. A small thing, a joke almost, said over wine at the cabin on a weekend in early spring when Claire had been 3 weeks out of the settlement and still walking with the slightly stunned quality of someone who has survived a significant impact. "You should just start your own practice," Donna had said. "A real one. Not the kitchen table version. Something with a name and a door, and people who sit across from you and sign contracts." And Claire had laughed. And then she had thought about it on the drive home. And then she had called the former colleague who had emailed her about coffee, and they had met, and that meeting had led to another meeting, and that other meeting had led to a third person joining the conversation, and by the time the summer was warm, Claire Merritt, who had spent 11 years making herself smaller to fit inside a marriage that had been counting down to its own expiration, had co-founded a financial consulting firm with 3 partners and a waiting list. She named it Copper and Time. Her sister had laughed for approximately 90 seconds when she heard that. Claire had laughed too. She had not moved out of the house. She had considered it. She had looked at apartments downtown with big windows and thought about the clean simplicity of starting entirely fresh. But in the end she had stayed because the house was hers, genuinely legally in every possible sense hers, and she had decided that she was not the one who should have to leave. She had, however, changed things. The guest room that had been Derek's refuge became her office. She added a second herb garden on the back patio, a larger one with the ambitions that the windowsill had never quite had room for. She had a friend over for dinner. Then she had several friends over for dinner. She discovered, to a surprise that embarrassed her slightly, that she was quite good company when she wasn't managing the invisible labor of a marriage she'd been losing faith in for years. Patricia sent her a card on the 6-month anniversary of the settlement signing. It said simply, "You should be proud of yourself." Claire put it on the refrigerator. Nadia had moved out of state. There had been no further contact, and Claire had decided that was the right shape for it. A story that had run its course, a person who had done what she needed to do and departed. There was no simple feeling available for someone like Nadia, and Claire had stopped looking for one. Derek was in the news occasionally. He had bought a large property somewhere warm and had given a brief interview to a regional magazine about his plans to invest in startup ventures, and he looked in the photograph exactly like someone who had been given an enormous amount of money and not yet figured out what it meant. Claire had read the article with a cup of coffee in her own kitchen and felt very little, which she recognized as a form of freedom. The phone call, the one she'd received in her kitchen 6 months ago, the call she'd been about to answer when the story last left her, had been from a journalist. Not a tabloid, not a gossip outlet, but a long-form writer for a financial magazine who had been investigating the use of LLC structures to shelter lottery winnings in divorce proceedings and had come across her case through public records. The journalist had asked carefully, professionally, with genuine interest, whether Claire would consider participating in the story. Claire had stood at her kitchen window, looking at the garden, and she had thought about it for a long moment. And she had said yes. Not for revenge, she was very clear with herself about that, but because the story, told accurately, and with its full architecture visible, was a story that might be useful to someone else standing in a kitchen somewhere, reading a text from an unknown number, trying to figure out if what they were seeing was real. The article had been published 2 months ago. It was careful and fair and did not name Nadia, and referred to Derek only by an initial. It had been read, according to the journalist, by an unexpectedly large number of people. Claire had received, in the weeks after publication, over 400 emails from women who had recognized something in it. She had read all of them. She had not been able to respond to all of them, but she had read them, and she had felt something she could only describe as the particular honor of having told a true thing in a way that found its audience. On the day that marked exactly 6 months from the settlement signing, Claire woke up before the alarm. Old habit. She put on her robe, a new one, soft green, and padded downstairs and made coffee. The kitchen was the same and different. The copper pots still hung from the rack, the herb garden still lined the sill, the morning light still scattered gold across the walls. But there was more now. A second set of coffee mugs for guests. A corkboard by the door covered in business cards and notes, and a card from Patricia. A stack of folders on the table that represented the morning's work, which she would begin at 9 and finish at noon, and which would pay her more in an hour than she had asked Derek for in a month. She poured her coffee. She stood at the window. The garden was growing with the particular confidence of things that have found their right conditions. She thought about what she would say if someone asked her what she had learned. She turned the question over carefully, the way she turned everything. She thought she might say that the things you do quietly for years without recognition do not disappear. That the capacities you maintain against the odds, the skills you practice at a kitchen table, the accounts you keep in your own name, the observations you file away, are not invisible simply because no one is watching them. That you can be underestimated for a very long time and then, in the space of a few weeks, stop being underestimated entirely, and discover that you were ready for exactly that moment without ever quite knowing you were preparing for it. She might say that, or she might just say, pay attention. Keep records. Don't make yourself smaller than you are for anyone who does not know what you're worth. She drank her coffee in her kitchen, in her house, in the life she was building with both hands, and she felt, cleanly, fully, without qualification, exactly like herself. And outside the kitchen window, the rosemary was reaching toward the light.